Hello again, friends, as I mess up and forgot to put my other light on, so hang on one second, please. Welcome again to another edition of Wrestling with Rusty right here on YouTube for September the 5th, 2024. Thank God NFL football is back tonight, which is Thursday, and we'll be back on a full schedule Sunday of this week because AEW and the wrestling industry has really gone to hell. And that's what this video is about. Stephen P. New. Yes, that same Stephen P. New that sponsors Jim Cornette's podcast and is Jim Cornette's personal lawyer, is also CM Punk's lawyer, and is also now former AEW wrestling announcer Kevin Kelly and the Tate twins lawyer in a lawsuit against AEW. Now, for those of you that say, who in the hell are the Tate twins? The Tate twins are known as the Boys in Ring of Honor, ROH. They were the boys that were the valets for Dalton Castle in Ring of Honor. Let me start from the beginning. Stephen P. New is representing Kevin Kelly in his lawsuit against AEW for basically wrongful termination. It is alleged that Kevin Kelly was let go months ago from Ring of Honor because current AEW wrestling announcer Ian Riccaboni had made allegations that Kevin Kelly was anti-Semitic and racist and various other things, and that is turning out not to be true. And a QAnon conspirator and all these things that basically Donald Trump is, but not Kevin Kelly. And more on that in a minute. And so Kevin Kelly has been unable to find work in wrestling since his departure last year, or his being let go of his announcing job at AEW due to the allegations. And long story short, he's hired Stephen P. New. Yes, that Stephen P. New that represents Jim Cornette, CM Punk, and many other wrestlers, and is looking for a big financial settlement. The terms of that settlement have not been disclosed yet. But I'm sure that'll come out in the end, probably, unless everybody has to sign non-disclosure agreements. But also, in addition to that, the Tate twins were let go by AEW supposedly for missing AEW wrestling dates last year, and they seem to have proof that might be wrongful termination on AEW's part. AEW wrestling announcer Jim Ross, JR, said on a Conrad Thompson podcast recently that the contract or the alleged allegations were basically bullshit. But Jim Ross is no lawyer, so Jim Ross should keep his mouth shut. I respect Jim Ross for his years in wrestling and his years in talent relations. But I do not respect Jim Ross in terms of trying to go against Stephen P. New or any other lawyer, especially Stephen P. New, since Stephen P. New not only is a lawyer, but a lawyer and a pro wrestling fan and a lawyer that represents many pro wrestlers. So I would assume that Tony Khan, the owner of AEW, will have to get out his checkbook and eventually pay Kevin Kelly and the Tate twins for back wages or wrongful termination or whatever label you want to put with it. Because trust me, Stephen P. New does not take a case unless he believes he can win it. As he said earlier tonight on a podcast of his own, he said he's won some cases that he's lost and lost some cases that he won. But generally speaking, it's my opinion that you have to get up pretty early in the morning to fool Stephen P. New. So more details as this becomes available It's just in the beginning stages now. So I suspect to make it go away, Tony Khan will eventually probably get out his checkbook and pay Stephen P. New and Kevin Kelly and the boys and make it go away, and they'll sign non-disclosure agreements, and we'll never know how much they got. But for now, AEW is expected to file a motion that they disagree with this, and I'm assuming it will go before a judge. Hopefully, if it goes before a judge, that judge will finally determine that pro wrestlers are not independent contractors, that they are employees, because how can you call a wrestler, as they have done for decades, an independent contractor, but yet prohibit that same wrestler or wrestlers from working for another company without the permission of the original company? For instance, if I'm working for Coke, Coke is not going to allow me to go to work for Pepsi while I'm still working for Coke, as an example, or being paid by Coke. So the same principle applies in wrestling. The difference is that wrestling promotions like AEW, WWE, and many others have gotten by with that independent contractor excuse for decades. And hopefully this Kevin Kelly lawsuit will shed some light on not only that and bring to light that pro wrestlers are not really independent contractors, even though that's what the government classifies them as. And secondly, maybe Tony Khan will have to break out his checkbook and pay Kevin Kelly and the boys for wrongful termination last year based on the comments of Ian Riccaboni and others in AEW. And keep in mind, I always close my podcast out here by saying, that's going to do it for me. Rusty, I'm out of here. We'll see you next time with another edition of Wrestling with Rusty right here on YouTube. And until we meet again, my friends, as the voice of AEW, Ian Riccaboni would say, happy wrestling, everybody. Well, I have much respect for Ian Riccaboni and his ability to be a wrestling announcer. But at this point, unless he has something that he has not shown yet, there is no evidence to prove that Kevin Kelly was a QAnon sympathizer, a racist, or whatever else is alleged in the redacted complaint that has recently come to light. So Ian Riccaboni might be in trouble, and so will AEW. The difference is Tony Khan and Tony Khan's daddy, Shad Khan, the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars and Fulham soccer team and many other businesses, has a boatload of money, and Shad Khan is the 8th richest billionaire in the United States of America, even more billions than Vince McMahon. So Tony Khan will just buy his way out of it. But Ian Riccaboni might not be able to do so because Ian Riccaboni is not even a millionaire. So this will get interesting before it gets better, so to speak. More details as it becomes available. At this point, that's all I know. While I got you here, though, let me also address the fact that WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, is now coming out and complaining, saying that AEW is paying outrageous contracts and driving up the price of those contracts, which is not good for business. Well, far be it from me to be a WWE sympathizer because I don't support AEW. And hello to Chris Ruth out there. Chris, nice to see you, and whoever else. The other ones of you who are here watching this live now on September 5th, 2024, put your names in the chat and I'll acknowledge you free. It don't cost you nothing. But hello, Chris, and whoever else is out there. But my point is, far be it from me to be a sympathizer for WWE, because I hate WWE creatively, and I hate WWE as a business for reasons we won't get into here. But long story short, have you noticed every time WWE gets in trouble or WWE sees the tide turning to AEW or any other wrestling promotion. I saw it happen back in the 80s when Jim Crockett Promotions, NWA, was running against WWE. They always had something bad to say, and they did many bad things to Jim Crockett Promotions. And Chris Ruth here is saying, I like AEW, but I liked it better 2 years ago more. Yeah, I did too, Chris. I liked AEW better when not Tony Khan, but when Cody Rhodes was there and booking. WWE is an average promotion. Yeah, Chris, I agree with you on that. But the bigger issue is, besides that point, WWE just thinks that their shit don't stink, and they think that nobody else is supposed to be in the wrestling business but WWE. Now, obviously, they're not going to say that, and they lost an antitrust lawsuit with MLW years ago, in which they had to pay MLW, I think, $20 million in the antitrust lawsuit. And AEW's owner, Kurt Bauer, is now $20 million richer because of WWE. But the point I'm trying to make is all of those past and present that have worked for WWE think that WWE is supposed to be the only one in the wrestling business, even if they don't say that publicly. And Chris says here again, exactly. So I'm assuming he agrees with my comments concerning WWE. Having said all that, my point is WWE is in no position to be worrying about what AEW is paying their wrestlers. I get on here and I complain about what AEW is paying their wrestlers because a lot of AEW's talent is marginal at best, except for MJF and Darby Allin, maybe, and the retired Sting. Most of the rest of them couldn't wrestle their way out of a paper bag, but yet they're getting paid millions. So I can complain about that. But when WWE complains about it, it just seems like sour grapes because WWE spent many years trying to badmouth anybody else in the wrestling business. So the WWE should be worried about WWE and not worried about AEW. And I would say the same thing about AEW. They shouldn't worry about WWE. They should worry about AEW because both AEW and WWE, both of them now, are not exactly setting the world on fire. And Chris is saying again, the WWE are way too brand driven. I agree, Chris. And Michael Hill here is saying, good evening, Rusty Loudermilk and everyone. And Joe Dyer is saying, what in this is this? Joe, in case you don't know, this is Wrestling with Rusty right here on YouTube, a free podcast about the wrestling business. And this particular video is about the lawsuit filed by the boys, better known as the Tate twins of AEW and ROH, and also former AEW announcer Kevin Kelly. So go back and watch the thing. I can't repeat it all here right now because we're 13 minutes into it and it would sound boring if I repeated it. But go back and watch it and you'll see what I'm saying. But WWE is in no condition to complain about AEW, and AEW is in no condition to complain about WWE because both of their products sucks for different reasons. And Chris Ruth here is saying, I really like MLW the most. I do too. The problem is MLW does not have a major platform, and they spend too much time with the backstage skits and not enough time on the wrestling product. But I do like MLW when they are doing their wrestling matches. I just don't like their low budgeted backstage skits, if that makes sense. And Joe Dyer says, rock on. Well, Joe, I don't know exactly what that means because I'm a little bit old. I'm 55. I guess rock on means good job. So thank you, Joe, and thanks to anybody else. But the point I'm trying to make is everybody's throwing stones at everybody else instead of worrying about their own product. But back to this particular issue, Time will tell how much AEW and Tony Khan and Shad Khan pay the Tate twins for firing them for missing dates that they claim they did not miss. And time will tell how much AEW and Tony Khan and Shad Khan have to pay Kevin Kelly for firing him, because it looks like that AEW and Ring of Honor announcer Ian Riccaboni does not, I repeat, does not have proof of Kevin Kelly being a QAnon member, because quite frankly, Kevin Kelly is not a QAnon member. And I don't think that Stephen P. New, Jim Cornette's attorney and CM Punk's attorney, would not take a case if he thought he was going to lose it. And Chris Ruth here says, I'm 53 and I've been a professional wrestling fan 44 years. Me too, Chris, but I tell you, regardless of the promotion, they sure as hell make it hard these days. Wrestling goes through a period where it gets a little better and then it gets really bad. And for an old school guy like me that grew up around Jim Crockett Promotions and knew many in Jim Crockett Promotions NWA, including the youngest member of the Crockett family and WCW cameraman Jackie Crockett, who passed away in 2021, it's hard for me to see how the wrestling business has deteriorated since I grew up around the wrestling business and Crockett Promotions. Joe Dyer here says AEW. I guess that means he likes AEW. He just put AEW, so I don't know what that means. But yeah, from a wrestling perspective, I like AEW, but AEW has got the same problem as MLW does, and also TNA back in the day. They spend too much time saying that they want to be an alternative product, but then they try to do everything to be just like WWE. And WWE's fans are never going away. That fan base is going to be there for the WWE for as long as they want it. So AEW and any other wrestling company, including MLW or others, should try to run their own race. But anyway, this video is about the lawsuits. So we'll have to wait and see how much money Kevin Kelly gets and also how much money the boys get for their wrongful termination. And one other comment here, Joe Dyer says, Khan's dad will stop funding AEW less than 10 years. I agree. I don't know when it'll be. Most say that Shad Khan, Tony's father, gave Tony his inheritance early, and that Tony's spending his inheritance, some of his inheritance money, rather than spending Shad's money. But quite frankly, I don't think that's the case. I believe Tony might have spent his original money, but Tony Khan is handing out money like a 14-year-old boy would hand out porn magazines. I mean, it's Tony Khan is just wasting so much money. It's ridiculous. And Joe Dyer says they'll settle with NDA. Yeah, I agree. That's what I said in the earlier part of the video, Joe, but you came in late. I said that Kevin Kelly and the boys, better known as the Tate twins, Brandon, and I can't think of Brandon's brother's name, but the Tate twins will get the money and they'll sign NDAs, and we'll never know how much they got. But if they can squeeze money out of Shad Khan and Tony Khan, God bless them. But I agree with Joe. Shad Khan or Tony Khan, one of them will stop funding it within 10 years. And if they don't, they're damn fools, because we're 5 years into AEW. And the fact of the matter is AEW is still losing money hand over fist. It doesn't have the luxury of getting $5 billion a year for the next 20 years or 10 years from Netflix. So unless Tony Khan and AEW get a streaming deal on par with WWE, which is always possible, but highly unlikely, unless they get that type of deal, they're not going to be profitable for a long time. And Chris Ruth here says, yes, Tony is about 40, but acts 14. Yeah, I agree with that. One thing, let me say this before I close it out. One thing that bothers me about Tony and AEW is that Tony Khan promised us that AEW was going to be a sports-based wrestling product, and they were going to be different than WWE. He told us that in 2019. Well, now it's almost 2025 in a few months, and AEW looks just like WWE, except a lower budgeted carbon copy of WWE. Look at all the people that are in AEW that are WWE rejects or former wrestlers of WWE. Heard Swerve signed a huge deal. Yeah, he did. I don't know the numbers of it, but I did. I heard that too somewhere going out on the internet here. And good for Swerve. If Swerve got his money, he deserves it because he happens to be one of the talents like MJF, Maxwell Jacob Friedman, that deserve every penny. But when you talk about some of these other wrestlers in AEW, some of them were getting paid back in 2019 probably 4 to 5 times what they were worth, and they never had any national television experience until they got to AEW. So Tony Khan has not managed his money correctly, but he's also not managed his creative for his company correctly either. So only time will tell what happens to AEW. But Joe Dyer brought up an interesting point a few minutes ago when he said Khan's dad will stop funding AEW in less than 10 years. I think so too. I think it might be less than 5 more years. And I also think that even though I hate to agree with Vince Russo, I think Shane McMahon met with Tony Khan recently to talk about buying AEW. I don't know that for sure, but I can't see Shane McMahon coming to work for AEW. But I could see Shane McMahon buying the company for either Shane McMahon or Vince McMahon, since Vince McMahon can't do it now due to all of Vince McMahon's legal troubles. But either way, even if that's not the case, AEW is a failing proposition that is just bleeding money like water. And Chris Ruth here says Tony Khan is definitely a mediocre to almost bad booker. Quite frankly, Tony Khan has admitted, Chris, that he takes some of his ideas from too many others in the company. Some of them are other wrestlers, and some of them are no good. And he also takes ideas from where he was a 14-year-old booker and wrote stuff down in composition books or tablets when he was 14 years of age. So, I mean, that's evident by the, what's the character name now that he just created? I forget the terrible character name. And Joe Dyer also agrees with Chris and says Tony Khan is a terrible booker. Tony Khan, if you call Tony Khan a booker, that's an insult to bookers, but I know what you guys meant, because technically, I guess you would call him a booker, but Tony Khan is so bad, I'm not even sure that I would even call him a booker, but I do get your point. But let's see what Joe Dyer says here. Wasted Arn Anderson. Hell yeah, Joe. Here's Joe, I'm going to expand on your point for a minute here. At one point, Tony Khan had Arn Anderson. He had Tully Blanchard. He has Dax Harwood and Cash Wheeler, FTR. He had or has Jake Roberts under contract. So how in the hell can you have Arn Anderson at one point, Tully Blanchard, Jake Roberts, all these people that are credited of not only being some of the greatest wrestling talent in the wrestling business, but some of the greatest minds that come up with angles and bookers in the wrestling business, and not take some of their suggestions. Tully Blanchard, and Joe, I'll get back to your other comment in a minute, but Tully Blanchard said recently that the whole 2 years that he was there in AEW, that nobody came up and asked him for advice. How in the hell can you have a roster full of people and they not come up and ask a legend like Tully Blanchard for advice? I'll tell you how. Because this generation does not want to take advice. All they want to do is do their flips and tumbles and everything, and do moves and get their spots in instead of doing professional wrestling. And about Dustin Rhodes, Joe Dyer talks about Dustin Rhodes. I don't know what he means by just Dustin Rhodes, but Dustin Rhodes is there too. Dustin Rhodes could give advice, even though I disagree with Dustin Rhodes' recent comment about don't call jobbers jobbers, but that's another video for another day. But Dustin Rhodes is also on the payroll. You let Cody Rhodes go, and Cody Rhodes was a damn good booker. And when I say let Cody Rhodes go, he might not have fired Cody Rhodes, but he damn sure didn't try hard to keep Cody when Cody left a couple of years ago either. And look where Cody is now in WWE. And Chris Ruth says again, Jake the Snake Roberts is one of the top 3 ring psychologists in professional wrestling. I agree, Chris, 100%. The others, like him or not, the top of that ring psychology would be Jim Cornette. If Tony Khan had a brain in his head, he should hire Jim Cornette to book AEW. But in order to do that, not only would he have to pay Jim Cornette, but he would have to allow Cornette to fire a lot in AEW. And the reality is AEW is not, I repeat, not a place in which you can be a boss. AEW is too many friends. That's where Jim Cornette got the phrase, all friends wrestling. And Joe Dyer says only Jim Cornette can save AEW. Well, yes and no, Joe. I say yes, Jim Cornette's the only one that can save it, but he has to have the support of Tony Khan. And the reality is Tony Khan of AEW is just as bad as Billy Corgan of NWA. They both have the money and they both own the companies, respectfully. And Chris Ruth says maybe. But Tony Khan of AEW can't get out of his own way and let somebody else book. And Billy Corgan can't get out of his way and let somebody else book. And Joe Dyer brings up a good point that Corgan is broke. Joe, I agree with you. But the reason why Corgan is broke is because he couldn't get out of his way years ago. Corgan should have let Nick Aldis book NWA like Nick Aldis was doing in the beginning, and keep Nick Aldis under contract. And Nick Aldis would probably still be booking NWA, and it would be a lot better than it is now. And Joe Dyer says fact. So I guess Joe Dyer agrees with me. And Chris Ruth says, I didn't know that. You didn't know what? That Nick Aldis booked NWA at one point? Yes, he did. In fact, Nick Aldis stopped booking NWA when Billy Corgan took the book over. And that's one of the reasons why Nick Aldis left. And you see what Nick Aldis is doing in WWE right now. Another good booker would be Adam Pierce. And Chris Root says Corrigan was broke. Chris, I think Joe means Corrigan's broke on money for NWA. Corrigan's not broke. He has the Smashing Pumpkins songs catalog, and he has a coffee shop and many other things outside of wrestling. So Corrigan's not broke, but Corrigan is not going to spend any more money on NWA. And that's why NWA was voted as the worst promotion about 5 months ago by Wrestling Observer newsletter. Joe Dyer says, Dutch Mantel. I agree. Dutch Mantel could do it. But Dutch Mantel would have the same problem as Cornette. And they're both friends. First of all, they would want total control, much like Paul Heyman would. But I don't think Tony Khan of AEW or Billy Corgan of NWA has any interest in giving up total control. I keep saying Tony, too many T's here. Tony Khan of the AEW and Billy Corgan of NWA do not have any interest of giving up total control of the booking process anymore. And that's the problem. They're letting their ego get in the way of business, much like ego got in the way with TNA concerning Dixie Carter. Joe Dyer, yes, I need a podcast. This is my only podcast right here. But part of the reason why I don't have a wider audience is because I happen to be a 55-year-old guy in a wheelchair who is on low income financing, and I don't have a lot of money, and I don't have the technical know-how to spread my audience bigger, to say iHeartRadio podcast or Spreaker or some of those other podcast platforms. So that's why I only have a YouTube show instead of having my YouTube show not only on YouTube, but other podcast platforms. I'll help. Okay, Joe Dyer or anybody else, give me a call at 724-826-0449. Repeating, 724-826-0449. And or email me, either one, at Rusty, that's RUSTY, .Loudermilk, LOUDERMILK, at yahoo.com. Again, Rusty, RUSTY, .Loudermilk, LOUDERMILK, at yahoo.com. Like speak louder and give me milk. And you must put a dot between the first name and the last name. Otherwise, it's not going to go through. And it's at yahoo.com, or call me at 724-826-0449. And we'll talk about the podcast or anything else, past, present, or future. So hope that helps. I'll give you guys more information on this or any other issue as it becomes available. Tell your friends to subscribe to the channel if you hadn't done so already. Like the other videos on the channel. All this originally was not just a pro wrestling YouTube channel, but about a year and a half ago, I started in March of 2020, and about a year and a half ago or so, it used to be WVU, West Virginia football, pro wrestling, and Steelers. I've dropped the Steelers from the channel, and I've dropped WVU because I found that more people like my pro wrestling content than they do the other sports content. And after all, there's tons of Steeler podcasts out there, and there are tons of West Virginia podcasts out there. So I just try to give my knowledge of being around wrestling since I knew the Crockett's from age 3 till from the early 70s till about 2021, possibly. And then Jackie Crockett, 1/5 owner of the Crockett Company, and I had a disagreement, and Jackie didn't speak to me anymore. But I'll always have respect for Jackie Crockett and the legendary Crockett family and all they tried to do to compete with WWE. And So let's see. I can't read this person's name, but someone says shout out to the chat, including Rusty Loudermill. Keep up the good work on the South Bronx, brother BKL. Um, Counterverse, aka Sports Entertainment Guy. Well, thank you, Sports Entertainment Guy, and thank you anybody that's watching this now, or will be watching it on playback in the future. Joe Dyer says, "I know Dutch personally, and live close to Corny and see them often." Yeah, Corny was actually in NWA when NWA first started in 2019, and when that pedophile what was his name? Somebody help me out. Dave Lagana, that's his name. When the pedophile or sexual harasser got in trouble and Billy Corgan let Dave Lagana go, that was the beginning of the end for the new NWA and Billy Corgan. But point being is, prior to that, Jim Cornette was in NWA and told the joke that Ray Traylor, Big Bubba Rogers, told many years ago that said, Big Bubba Rogers is so tough that you could strap a bucket of chicken on his back and he could ride a moped through Ethiopia. And of course, that was perceived to have made a racial comment concerning Black Americans and buckets of chicken. But that was an old joke that Corny has told for a number of years. And if you're that damn unsensitive, you shouldn't be watching pro wrestling. That's what's also wrong with pro wrestling. It's pro wrestling is, as Jim Cornette would put it, too sanitized and too overly produced. And that controversy concerning the bucket of chicken comment years ago was only one example of many examples of being overproduced. The other thing is, if AEW was going to be so damn different, why in the French fried titty fuck, excuse my language, does AEW now have a soap opera writer writing some of their crap like WWE does? In WWE's case, they got like 24 writers. AEW, I think, only has one besides Tony Khan. But still, wrestling should be booked and not written, if that makes sense. And Joe Dyer, my number is 724-826-0449. Repeating, 724-826-0449. And spread the word about the podcast and YouTube channel, past, present, and future. Tell your friends to subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. But if you have, come back here for other videos. I do this as a labor of love. I'd like to make some money, but I don't know how. Joe Dyer, if you know how I can make some money, I damn sure need it. But for now, I do this as a labor of love because I started knowing many in the Crockett days in the 1970s. And I knew Don Kernodle, who passed away in 2021. Don Kernodle committed suicide, for those of you that don't know. I talked in 2021. I talked to Don Kernodle 3 weeks before he passed away. I didn't know Don Kernodle was going to commit suicide. Otherwise, I would have helped him. But Don was always laughing and joking and cracking jokes on everybody, including me, and never told the truth about how much he was hurting. And he committed suicide after coming back from the doctor when the doctor gave him some bad news. And Chris Ruth is saying Don Kernodle was a nice guy. Don Kernodle was one of the nicest guys you'll ever want to meet. And I miss him daily. And there's a couple of videos on this channel here that were done in 2021 and 2024, I think, as well. of me talking about Don's death. And it still breaks my heart. And for those of you that are out there in the chat room right now, or for those of you that might be seeing this on playback, take it from a guy in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy who continues to lose my day-to-day mobility. Suicide is never the answer. But unfortunately, none of us expected Don to do it. And when Don committed suicide, it just killed me. And I know it killed his brother, Wally. Chris Ruth is saying, Ox Baker, Doug Baker was a nice guy as well. Yes. I used to heckle Ox Baker because back in the 80s, some of you might not know, and I'll come back to that story. Joe Dyer is saying, need number, brother, 724-826-0449. Repeating, 724-826-0449. Repeating, 724-826-0449. And now coming back to the Ox Baker story, Ox Baker in the 80s or late 70s, I think it was late 70s, early 80s, somewhere in that time frame, was on The Price is Right. And this is when kayfabe was still in effect. And Bob Barker was hosting The Price is Right. And whoever the announcer was at the time says, Douglas Baker, come on down. You're the next contestant on The Price is Right. And here comes Ox Baker. And I was home from school that day, and this was before DVRs or even VHS, VCRs. But I was home from school, and I said, damn, that looks like Ox Baker. And when he got up on stage, Bob Barker said, your shirt says Ox. What do you do? And Ox goes, I'm a professional wrestler. And they said something after that. I forget what they said. But then they went on with the game. But anyway, I remember Doug Baker from Jim Crockett Promotions back in the day when he tagged up with Carl Fergie. And Carl Fergie not only was a referee years later, but Carl Fergie was also the other cousin of Jerry the King Lawler. Obviously, Wayne Ferris, better known as the Honky Tonk Man, was the cousin of Jerry Lawler. But Carl Fergie doesn't get mentioned quite as much because Carl Fergie didn't make it as far in the business as Jerry Lawler did. But both Carl Fergie and Jerry Lawler are cousins with Wayne Ferris, the Honky Tonk Man. And by the way, I saw Doug Baker back in 2014, and he said hello, and I said hello back. But I had zoned out for a minute for whatever the reason, I don't remember. And I didn't really have a conversation with him. And about a month later, Ox Baker / Doug Baker passed away. So I regret that. Chris Ruth here says, Killer Carl Krupp was a nice guy as well. Yeah, Krupp was a Canadian. I think I may have met him back in the 70s with IWA, the International Wrestling Association, which originally was ran by Eddie Einhorn of Major Eddie Einhorn of Major League Baseball and Hockey. But Eddie Einhorn later sold out, and the IWA was then ran on a lower budget by the professional wrestler known as Johnny Powers. And then the Crockett's helped put the boots to the IWA back in the 70s when the IWA started running my hometown, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Greensboro, some of the old Crockett towns. But Crockett had a stronghold on that area, and the IWA then was not successful. So between Crockett and then Vince McMahon's WWF at the time, the IWA just went out of business. But yeah, Joe Dyer and Chris or anybody else that can help me better this podcast or the YouTube channel or both to get money or to increase the audience, I would appreciate it. And just to repeat, my number is 724-826-0449. And my email again is rusty, RUSTY, .loudermilk, LOUDERMILK, @yahoo.com. I also need a girlfriend if you guys know of a girlfriend that don't mind dating a guy in a wheelchair. Joe Dyer says, brother, you have great knowledge. Joe, you know what it comes from? It comes from knowing Don Kernodle, knowing Ivan Koloff, knowing Jackie Crockett. But it also comes from when you were a guy in a wheelchair in the 70s, you didn't have the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, or advocates to advocate for you because you didn't have any rights. So as a guy in a wheelchair, I couldn't go many places because many places were not wheelchair accessible. And so wrestling, pro wrestling specifically, became an escape to escape my real life problems of being full-time in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy. So I had no choice but to find something to drown my problems in. And the girls weren't coming along back then, and they're certainly not coming along too much now. So you got to have something to occupy your time. If you can't get pussy, you might as well have fun with pro wrestling. But in any event, thank you guys for your kind words, past, present, and future. Special thanks to special investigator of the channel, Raymond Tipton, who is always very helpful with the channel. And people keep coming in, so I'll stay here as long as you guys are staying here with me. Joe Dyer says, S.D. Jones was another nice guy, as was Bobby Eaton. I think I only met S.D. Jones once, and I only met Bobby Eaton once. I don't know anybody that knew S.D. Jones that well, but I only met him once, but he seemed to be a nice guy. And Bobby Eaton, besides Ivan Koloff and Don Kernodle, Bobby Eaton would probably go down as 1, 2, and 3 of the nicest guys in the history of the wrestling business from a personal level, okay? Ivan Koloff might not have been the biggest guy, or Don Kernodle might not have been the biggest guy, but they were nice human beings, and they made it a hell of a long way and were tops in their craft. And Bobby Eaton was one of the greatest damn tag team wrestlers in the history of the planet, bar none. These wrestlers today could not hold the jock strap of Don Kernodle, Bobby Eaton, or Ivan Koloff, or wrestlers of that area. Joe Dyer says, I will call or text you soon. I'm somewhat of an insider when it comes to the extent of promoting local events, and will help you produce your production with wrestling. I've been a huge fan since the 80s. Joe, I've been a huge fan since about 1974. Tell you a story. I will read my comments later after I sign off, Joe Dyer. But as long as people are staying here, I'm going to stay here and talk. This is very good therapy for me. But about 1972, at the age of 3 years old, my cousin Karen Gardner had been going to wrestling years earlier. And Joe says, awesome. And she got me going to wrestling. And somehow, I don't remember how, but I met Jackie Crockett. And then Karen started dating Byron Scott. And Byron Scott was Byron Richards' referee in the WWF. Byron Scott was Byron Richards, referee in South Atlantic Pro Wrestling. And Byron Scott was a road agent for WCW World Championship Wrestling. And Byron Scott's father was George Scott, the legendary wrestling promoter. And let me stop right there for a minute. I know this was supposed to be about AEW and their lawsuit, and that's what most of it was. But you guys are bringing out a tremendous amount of positive knowledge from me. But George Scott does not get his credit as booker as he should. He stayed around some territories too long, and any booker gets booker. They just get where they can't come up with ideas, and then you need to make changes. As the big cat Ernie Ladd used to say, sometimes your brain is like a sponge and it needs to be wrung out. Well, the bookers sometimes in those days, and now too, when there are bookers, their brain needs to be wrung out, but they stay too long because of the money. And now it's harder to find a booker than it is to find a writer, because a lot of these writers don't have never written wrestling until they got a job with WWE. I mean, even the AEW lady, Jennifer, who is writing some of AEW stuff now. Jennifer got a job with WWE, and she admitted on the AEW podcast recently that she didn't know a damn thing about pro wrestling until she got a job with WWE. So how in the hell can writers write wrestling if they've never written wrestling before? Boy, that's a tongue twister. John Dyer says, I grew up close to Memphis, so I saw tons of stars through the years. That's good, Joe. We need to compare notes, and you need to help me with the podcast as well. Yeah. Big John, and Joe says, Big John Studd should have been a bigger star. I agree. But politics in pro wrestling, both then and now, are a big problem. And sometimes the people with the most talent don't always get a break. And yes, the real Chris Ruth says John Studd was selfless and kind. It looks like Chris said, and I met John a couple times, and the real life John Minton, Minton. John Minton was John Studd's real name. The real life John Minton was also a nice guy. Very, very nice guy. Joe Dyer says his own fault. I'm assuming that Joe Dyer is speaking about the soap opera writers who are writing wrestling are Tony Khan's own fault and WWE's own fault. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, Joe. But yeah, we need to get all the writers from WWE, and we need to get the writers from AEW, and we need to put them all in a room with Donald Trump and anybody else as punishment for writing pro wrestling, because writers don't need to write pro wrestling. Bookers need to book pro wrestling. How in the hell are you going to tell somebody what they need to do in wrestling if you've never been a wrestling fan and you've never been in the ring? I've never been in the ring, but I was a wrestling fan. But these writers, admittedly, most of them never even saw a wrestling match until they got a job with either WWE or AEW. And Joe Dyer says, you're right. Thank you, Joe. But unfortunately, at the age of 55, not knowing how long myself or anybody else has on this earth, I'm not sure we'll see bookers book wrestling anymore. I think corporate wrestling is now subject to pro wrestling writers. And that's part of the reason why it's going downhill. And let me repeat, Tony Khan and Billy Corrigan and others are not good owners. Because if they were good owners, they'd have enough sense to back the hell out of the writing process and let Cornette and Dutch Mantel or others book the shows and fire all these writers. And Joe Dyer says, that's why Corny hates Russo. I agree. And excuse the way I put this, guys, but if you take all the hell, goddamn, motherfuck, and shit out of Cornette's comments and you listen to the Cornette's comments without all the cussing, you discover that Jim Cornette is a hell of a wrestling booker. And you got to get up pretty early in the morning to fool Jim Cornette on two things. You got to get up pretty early in the morning to fool Jim Cornette on pro wrestling. And you got to get up pretty early in the morning to fool Jim Cornette on rock and roll trivia. Russo can't hold Cornette's jockstrap. Okay? Joe Dyer says, you should come to Tennessee. Still have great wrestling. I don't have the money, Joe. If you give me some more money, I would love to move to Nashville as an example, because Nashville has a lot of services for people with disabilities that I don't have here. Plus, over in Nashville, they have the Broadway Street or Broadway Avenue, whatever that music row of bars and restaurants there that play country music from like 10 in the morning to like 2 a.m. the next morning. So I'd love to come to Nashville. So Joe, help me expand my podcast, make me some money, and let me move to Nashville. Because if you got some old school wrestling down there, I'd love that too. We'll work on that if you want. Bourbon Street. Well, Bourbon Street, I think, is in New Orleans. So I have no interest in going to New Orleans, but I might like to move to Nashville. But either way, what I would like to see, getting back to wrestling, is I would like to see pro wrestling return to being pro wrestling and not sports entertainment. And specifically, I would like to see Tony Khan do what he promised and become an alternative to WWE. But in reality, Tony Khan's AEW is falling into the same trap as TNA did back in the day. They're just a carbon copy of WWE, just a lower budgeted brand. That's all. Chris Ruth says, Jim Cornette is a wrestling encyclopedia. He is beyond a genius. I agree. I didn't say it exactly that way, but that's what I meant. Jim Cornette is a wrestling genius. Cornette gets a bad rap because he uses goddamn and motherfucker and fuck you and thank you, fuck you, bye, and all these bad words. He uses them so much, and he doesn't believe in God. He's a card-carrying atheist, along with his former best friend, Kenny Bolin. So Cornette gets a bad rap. But if you take all the hell, goddamn, and shits out of Cornette's comments and you listen to Cornette, there's no doubt that Jim Cornette could be an asset again to any company. But you can't be, excuse my language, but you can't be a pussy. And there are too many pussies in the wrestling business these days, wrestling, and there are too many pussies behind the scenes too. As the old saying goes, I liked it better when the marks were out front in the crowd. Now the wrestlers wrestle for the boys in the back of the dressing room. They don't wrestle for the crowd. And overall, in most cases, attendance is down. Joe Dyer says in here, yeah, Corny, definitely going to hell, LOL. Yeah, Corny's going to hell while saying there is no hell. You're right. because Jim Cornette doesn't believe in heaven or hell. I do. Let me say I'm a Christian, and I believe in heaven and hell. And Jim Cornette will be in hell, sure, because unfortunately, the only thing I've ever disagreed with Jim Cornette about is Jim Cornette doesn't believe there is a God. And I know there's a God. And I know that God placed me in a wheelchair for some reason that I don't even necessarily know yet. But anyway, getting back to wrestling, Chris Ruth said, it's hilarious when he makes fun of Kevin Dunn. Yeah, Chris, Jim Cornette calls Kevin Dunn Bucky Beaver and says he couldn't get laid in a whore. Well, and he also says that Vince Russo and Kevin Dunn couldn't get laid in a whorehouse with a fistful of 50s. So yeah, that's. And by the way, Kevin Dunn is the most sorriest piece of shit on the planet. I've never met Kevin Dunn personally, but people that I know that know Kevin Dunn say that he only got his job because he saved the tapes from a burning car for Vince McMahon years ago. Or not Kevin Dunn saved the tapes, but Kevin Dunn's dad saved the tapes. And as a favor to Kevin Dunn's dad, Kevin Dunn got a job for life in WWE. And Kevin Dunn is a multimillionaire now because of WWE. So Kevin Dunn is a perfect example of people that had no talent and were in the right place at the right time with that same no talent. Joe Dyer says, you're a cool ass dude, man. Glad I came across your show. Yeah, Joe, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends to subscribe. And yes, I appreciate you saying I'm a cool ass dude. You know why I'm a cool ass dude, Joe, or anybody else in here? Because I'm poor as shit, but I don't let it get me down. And I've got a wrestling past, but I want to see wrestling get back to the way it was, not the way it is, if that makes sense. And Joe Dyer is asking, did you spend any time with Jimmy Valiant? Yes, I did. And I'm disappointed. Let me tell you why I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in Jimmy Valiant because the Jimmy Valiant that I met in the early 80s at what was then Park Center, but now the Grady Cole Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, Jimmy Valiant was a kind man. As Jimmy got up on an age and retired from wrestling and that he become more about money and stuff. No, Joe Dyer is asking, did he kiss you? No, Jimmy Valiant didn't kiss me. Jimmy Valiant outside of the wrestling business is not the boogie woogie and yay and all this and jumping around and all that. He's not all that. He was very quiet and very kind person. But in later years, he's been all about money. And so I'm disappointed in Jimmy right now. But I always had a good rapport with him the few times I saw him. And Chris is right. Jimmy was a laid back dude in the day. Yeah. Boy, he had a hot looking wife too. Big Mama Felicia. And Jimmy Valiant's real name was Jimmy Valen, I think, Valen, not Valiant. And by the way, in case you don't know, Jimmy Valiant and Johnny Valiant were not brothers. Johnny Valiant's name, I think, was Tom Sullivan, and Jimmy Valiant was Jimmy Valen. So they were not related. But yeah, and some Joe Dyer up here earlier in the podcast said, and I'm because I'm catching up on the comments. He said, let me find it again. Joe, help me, Joe. Where you at? Oh, he said Nashville too, bro. Yeah, I want to go home to Charlotte, North Carolina. That's my ultimate goal. But if I had to go to Nashville, that would be a nice number 2 place to end up, because Nashville has a lot for people with disabilities, and they got my country music, and I'm a country music fan. And also the guy that ran the paratransit system, which is the door-to-door bus service for people with disabilities here in Pittsburgh called Access. The guy that ran that service is now in Nashville as their transit director. So he would shit bricks if he saw me come into a Nashville transit meeting. They fired that son of a bitch named Steve Bland, B-L-A-N-D, Bland. Steve Bland in Pittsburgh. They fired his ass. And he ended up getting a job as the transit director in Nashville. But anyway, Joe Dyer says, I always knew that Jimmy Valiant was a laid-back dude, okay? Is his museum still open? Yes, Joe Dyer. Jimmy Valiant's museum is open, and it's also a wrestling school. I think it's in Shanksville or Sharksville, Virginia. You'll have to search the internet for the exact name and spelling, but I believe he has open gym and teaching on Sunday afternoons. It's ran by Jimmy Valiant and his new wife, Angel. I think it's Shanksville, Virginia. I have no idea where Shanksville, Virginia is, but there's a YouTube video on YouTube. I don't know the title of it, but it shows a tour of Jimmy Valiant's museum. So you might want to look at that before you go. So you can see that steep ass hill you got to go up when you go to the wrestling school. Let's see what else. Somebody, I don't know what somebody meant by great comedy club. I don't know if they meant Jimmy Valiant was. Yeah, Jimmy Valiant was more like in the 80s. He was more like a comedy type wrestler in terms of you'll never confuse him with Harley Race or anybody like that. But he still had his fans, and he knew how to get the fans involved, especially kids and African Americans as well. But anyway, I appreciate you guys coming to the channel tonight. Tell your friends to subscribe to the channel. And even if some don't subscribe, tell them to come back to the channel. I don't have a specific day that I do live streams, but I always live stream when I record something to YouTube. I never tape it anymore. So subscribe so you can keep abreast as to when I'll have another live stream, and come back to the channel. Tell your friends to come back as well. Thanks, guys. I love you all, and I hope you all will be calling me to try to help me out to expand this YouTube channel or podcast. And once again, my number for those that might need it that don't have it is 724-826-0449. And my email is rusty, R-U-S-T-Y, .loudermilk@yahoo.com. And Chris Ruth says, bye, Chris. And Joe Dyer says, who is your favorite wrestler of color ever? Joe Dyer is saying Brickhouse Brown. I didn't know Brickhouse Brown personally, but I saw him wrestling. He was a good wrestler, period, black or otherwise. But my favorite black wrestler would have to be a Thunderbolt Patterson, or the legendary Sonny King, real name Lawrence Johnson, who passed away a few days ago at the age of 79. But in ring, as far as black goes and on the promos, long before Road Dogg Brian James was saying, you better call somebody, Thunderbolt Patterson was saying, oh, you better call somebody. And then another time he would say, if I only had time. And the way he would say it, and his neck movements and his body language, just Thunderbolt Patterson was not only a hell of a wrestler, but he was great on promos. And Joe Dyer says, I thought you'd say JYD. And JYD was a hell of a wrestler, but you didn't ask me which black ones were a hell of a wrestler. You asked me which one was my favorite. And my sentimental favorite would have to be Thunderbolt. But JYD, real name Sylvester Ritter, was a great wrestler, black or otherwise, back in the day. And I also met JYD on about 3 occasions, I think. And he was a nice guy, and he knew the difference between Junkyard Dog and Sylvester Ritter too. The only problem is he liked his pussy too much, and he liked cocaine too much. But as a wrestler, JYD was a hell of a wrestler, and I'm sorry that he died some years ago in a car wreck when he fell asleep at the wheel. But anyway, I'm gonna sign off here for now. All you guys keep in touch who are here in the live stream or on playback. Tell your friends to subscribe to the channel. Watch some of the other wrestling videos on the channel, the other sports videos on the channel for Steelers and WVU football are old by now, so they're not worth watching. But watch some of the other pro wrestling content on the channel. And please remember my friend Don Kernodle, who passed away in 2021 of suicide. And if you or someone you know is thinking about committing suicide or has had battles with depression, please call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-TALK. They're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They never close. That's going to do it for me, Rusty. I'm out of here. We'll see you next time for another edition of Wrestling with Rusty right on YouTube. Until we meet again, my friends, happy wrestling, everybody. And thank you for your past, present, and future support. Raymond Tipton, thank you for your past, present, and future support. Raymond Tipton, special investigator of the channel. Thank you all. Take care. Call me. Bye.